Hello there. What is going on, everyone? Today we are going to be talking about some games that we really need in the Star Wars universe. With AMG's cancellation of X-Wing and Armada, it has brought to my mind and to many viewers here that there are a lot of important scenes, themes, theaters of combat, and settings that are being ignored. And while the Star Wars universe is not a cheap intellectual property to have a license holder for, it's kind of baffling that Atomic Mass you would drop the entire space theater. It leaves many to wonder if there is a new space game being created that might bridge the gap between X-Wing and Armada, or something similar. Will it be on a sprue and all of that? But it also brings to light certain other settings, themes, and environments that are not being represented. And while the license for Star Wars games is not cheap, it does mean that a company like Asmodee is going to want to try to get the most that they can. And there are definitely some crucial areas that they're ignoring right now. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about some of those settings and certain games that they should be making, games that we definitely need and I would like to see. And you can let me know down in the comments if you agree with any of these, or if you have any extra suggestions on game types or theaters of games that that basically you want to see that I didn't mention in this video. Plus, we are also want to announce that I'm going to be doing the 12 Days of Life Day again this year in December. So during the month of December, I will be doing 12 giveaways. This will be split up between patrons and regular subscribers. So and I'll be announcing over the course of videos who wins, and what you're going to win is going to be a complete surprise. If you want to check out previous years' December videos, you know, it's everything from it's just surprise giveaways. And if you want to have a chance to enter to win those, you just have to be a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my videos. Plus, if you're a patron as well, patrons are going to get extra opportunities, because anything that, you know, first off, patrons can win, but on top of that, patrons also will get anything that goes unclaimed. I give everybody 30 days to contact me after you've been announced as a winner, and traditionally, you know, multiple things go unclaimed each year, and those roll over into Patreon. So if you are interested, plus there's plenty of reasons to be a patron. You can get your name in the credits, a wing or higher level, and you also get Discord roles. You also have early access to battle reports and other things like that. So a lot of cool stuff. So if you're interested in supporting the channel, check it out. But let's go ahead and talk about some different games that I think we need to see. First off, pod racing. I think it's been long enough, and I think people are over the initial prequel hate, and I think a pod racing game actually has a lot of merit. And I'm going to tell you why. I think in today's society, it's not just pods. You could open it up to an entire racing game. Would not have to be only pods. You have plenty of swoop bikes that have shown up, Imperial speeder bikes, Solo. A Star Wars Story showed us like police level speeder bikes, and also a lot more in the way of just regular, you know, sort of commercial and private speeders as well. And so there's so many different speeders in Star Wars, and they're largely being ignored, with the exception of like the normal X-23 land speeder or whatever Luke's model was from A New Hope that shows up, you know, here and there. Most speeders and speeder bikes are ignored outside of, you know, like, again, Luke's and maybe the regular Imperial speeder bike. But you hardly see any swoop bikes. You hardly see any pod racers or anything like that. And there is entire genres of racing board games. And so this could be, and of course there are some, you know, some racing miniatures games out there too, some that use actual cars, some that, you know, use, you know, you can kind of build your own terrain. And building your own terrain and building your own board is certainly an exciting way to be able to do things. And I also feel that doing something like the Boonta Eve Classic and setting up a really big, grand board would make for an amazing convention display and way to showcase a game like a pod racing game. I think it just sells itself. I think at this point you have so many adults who grew up with Episode 1 and were influenced by The Phantom Menace. that this would sell itself. This would be very, very easy to do. You could even potentially make this in the same scale as another game, like something like Star Wars Legion, and potentially make certain units that pull double duty and can function in both games. I think it'd be like printing money. I think it'd be a very easy way to make a whole new type of game, and for it to be a lot of fun, and to make some really interesting boards. Racing games are really fun. One of the ones that I really like is a game called Pitch Car, although that one is a little bit more of a dexterity game. But building a whole racetrack when you're setting up your board can be really fun. There's a lot that can happen there, and then it's bonus points if you can add more players and have like, hey, we're full, we don't have our max 8 players, but do you want to play 2? Okay, you can be the Tusken Raider snipers that are perched up on this mountaintop and stuff, and get like a big campaign games, or that, not campaign games, but rather like convention games that a lot of people can participate in. It could be really cool. And again, I think it's a space that's really lacking in the Star Wars gaming realm that used to be represented in video games, by the way. Next up, Order 66 as a concept. It really isn't covered very much in tabletop games, or even in video games for that matter, that much. And I think it kind of represents an opportunity for either a tabletop game, whether it's a miniatures game or a board game. And this was probably something that would find its way outside of Atomic Mass games, but a different Asmodee studio like Fantasy Flight Games or Z-Man Games, or a similar company, because again, Asmodee does have the license, so any of their companies can make Star Wars games. And so this would be an opportunity to have maybe like a larger board game, something on the scale of like Rebellion, where the Emperor is closing in, trying to eliminate all Jedi. Maybe one player is playing the Jedi, the other player is playing the Empire, and they're trying to mount some kind of survival mechanic. Or it could be a multiplayer game where you're all playing different Jedi that are trying to survive, and maybe it's a kind of, not a teaming game, maybe not a cooperative game. Maybe every Jedi is out for themselves trying to just make it, and everybody has their own goals. You have to survive, but you also have to rescue a Padawan. You have to survive, but you also have to, so get some artifacts from the Jedi Temple before you do it, like a hidden victory condition kind of game, like a game like Nemesis had. I think it's a very cool setting and allows for some unique game design that hasn't really been done very much. And and it's hard to come up with new and unique ideas in the gaming world, especially in 2024, 2025, when board games have kind of done it all. But also in Star Wars, when you're kind of bound by the IP, there's limits on what you can do. And an Order 66 game would be really cool. And also, it's a very popular setting, right? So it's a cool mechanic that I think could work for a game. I want to talk about the Battle of the Battle of Hoth, Battle of Endor, Battle of Hoth, or even the Battle of Crate, also from Episode 8. But Battle of Hoth is more iconic. So let's talk about this, because we have Star Wars Legion. Star Wars Legion doesn't allow you to recreate the Battle of Hoth. It can let you recreate like a microcosm of the Battle of Hoth, but we don't have big battle games. And Star Wars very much has a lot of big battles. If you look at Rogue One's big ground battle at the end, there's numerous times where we see big ground vehicles, Battle of Geonosis, there's so many of these across the Clone Wars, across the Galactic Civil War, and also, as we see in Episode 8, even into the sequel trilogy and everything in between, there's a lot of these big ground battles, and there's no way to really replicate them. AMG has sort of hinted that maybe they'll kind of tiptoe a little bit closer to that way if they ever do grand armies for Star Wars Legion, but it does sound like that's very, very far out. And frankly, I don't think Legion is the right scale to do something like this anyway, because even if they do come up with a way to put an AT-AT on the table, still, that doesn't represent the Battle of Hoth. Battle of Hoth had many AT-ATs, AT-ATs if you prefer. I think we need maybe a 10mm game, something closer to the X-Wing scale. X-Wing was supposed to be working on something like this at some point before the changeover. And so I think it's definitely in the wheelhouse of Asmodee, and in some of the notes somewhere, that this was going to be something that they wanted to build towards. But maybe it would just serve better as its own thing, because I would love to see, Imperial Walkers that are like this big, and I can get 5 of them on a table if I want, and have a really big battle. I think that'd be gorgeous, and it'd be super fun to do. Other miniatures games have done stuff like this. Let's see it. Let's see it happen again. Again, arguably one of the most iconic battles in all of Star Wars, and it's not represented. Not fully. Let's jump to the sequel trilogy, and we talked a little bit about X-Wing. This would have been amazing to see launch alongside X-Wing, and it deals with the show Star Wars Resistance. They had starfighters that were racers in that setting. It was like kind of the backdrop for the show is that there were these ace pilots, and they raced around this planet's atmosphere, flying through rings. Very much a racing game. While this does have some similarities to a pod racer game, this one would have dealt more with aerial racing as opposed to being on the ground. The other thing that this one would have done differently is this one would have potentially had an integration with X-Wing miniatures game. My view for this, and I think a lot of people have shared this sentiment, and it just would have fit perfectly. So I'm not claiming exclusivity on the desire for something like this to happen. But this would have made a perfect separate game. Like, just call it Star Wars Resistance Racer. You could have still used X-Wing scale ships. You could have used X-Wing compatible bases and X-Wing compatible maneuver dials. You could have had some cards that were unique to this game mode, but it would have been like an alternate game mode for X-Wing, and it could have allowed for integration. It could have been a standalone game. Like, you don't ever have to play X-Wing. You could just play this racer, set up your rings on your table, fly around. Everybody who flies through all of them twice works. And, oh, yeah, your ships have, like, stun weapons, so you can kind of stun each other and slow each other down. If somebody gets out in front, that means they're going to be shot in the rear by everybody else. You know, it almost has like a Mario Kart sort of feel to it. The bonus for something like this is that you could then take those ships, and they could come with alternate cards that are also compatible with X-Wing. That might be slightly different from the racing game, but it allows somebody who gets into this and likes the overall mechanics of it to now say, hey, now let's take these ships up for a dogfight. Okay, let's put a proton torpedo on this guy and take him up into space. You know, and it could have worked. It could have pulled double duty as both an entry point for new players, a standalone game, and also an expansion for X-Wing. So that's something that could have happened. It could still happen. Again, if somebody were to kind of bring back X-Wing into development, this would make for a great way to have an alternate starter out there, or just a similar game altogether. You know, maybe something that doesn't have to have anything to do with X-Wing, but it could kind of borrow some of those components. Either way, it was a show, maybe not the most popular show that was out there, but I think it does represent, again, racing is something we don't see a whole lot of in Star Wars gaming, and so, you know, this was it was kind of a big deal for a while, and I think it's still valid. Moving forward, now this one, I'm going to go into a different genre of gaming, but it's going to deal with cloning, and sort of hidden role games. If you're not familiar with hidden role games, games like Werewolf, or games like The Resistance, or games like Blood on the Clock Tower, there's a lot of games where people have hidden roles, or Battlestar Galactica, which was one that Fantasy Flight had done years ago. They have a new version of it now, where, maybe basically the setting is, we don't know who's a clone of who. There's been a lot of cloning that has happened in, of course, the Clone Wars, but not just in the Clone Wars, but also as we go into, the Bad Batch, and then the Mount Tantus timeline, and then, of course, Palpatine cloning himself, and then making Snoke and all of this other stuff. Cloning is a crucial part of the history of Star Wars, as well as the future of Star Wars, as they're building towards more and more clone-related storylines. And if you're familiar with, the legends of Star Wars, and of course they had made clones of Luke Skywalker and stuff like that. So with that in mind, it makes for an interesting backdrop for a hidden role game as to, who's real and who's the clone. We all wake up and with amnesia, and we don't know who's the clone of who. It could be a really fun setting that you could put a Star Wars skin on and still keep it pretty thematic, especially if you tack in elements from the Bad Batch into here, and we're like, okay, you're clones, but maybe some of us have, special hidden talents that were kind of mutations from the cloning process. There's a lot of extra interesting things you could do, or which clone is a traitor. and we all have the same backstory. There's definitely a lot of ways to work in a trader mechanic and to hidden roles and mysteries into a cloning-based game. Probably wouldn't be a miniatures game, probably would be a card game, if I'm guessing, but still could work. One of those games where you have like 8 people sitting around a table and then everybody gets their card and they look at it and then they put it face back down, like, oh, I'm an evil clone. Okay. Something like that. We still, again, Thrawn coming back in Ahsoka. We need, an Armada replacement. I say Armada replacement because, again, they have dropped, development for Star Wars Armada. And I'll say this, Star Wars Armada never really felt like you had a full Armada, unless, of course, you were playing at a much higher points limit. So I wouldn't mind seeing maybe bigger in scale, but smaller ships. Star Destroyers that are, instead of this big, are like this big. So now I can have a whole fleet on my table. I can actually have an Armada, and especially with Thrawn being, coming back into live action in the Ahsoka show, and in the future of what that whole storyline is going to be, because we really didn't even figure it out what it's going to be. But it's definitely going to be involving ships. I mean, Thrawn is primarily a fleet admiral, a grand admiral, and he leads ships masterfully. He has done a few things on the ground, but it's also kind of astounding to me right now that while we're getting Thrawn in Legion and we have Thrawn in Shatterpoint, they only put Thrawn in ground games where he is least effective. So that doesn't make much sense. So again, put Thrawn into a space game, make a space game that celebrates Thrawn. Obviously, he is in Armada, but I'm talking about a new game, and maybe something that can give you a full Imperial fleet as opposed to 3 ships. So that's a thought. That's something that maybe they can do. I mean, if they do it, I imagine it will probably be on a sprue. I had talked a little bit about Star Wars Rebellion, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring that up. I definitely would love to see a new edition of Star Wars Rebellion, one that can allow it to flourish a little bit more, but maybe a separate version of Star Wars Rebellion. There are some that have told me that when I've said I think we should have a new version of Rebellion, they're like, no, leave it alone, it's perfect. And I will concede that it is very close to perfect. There's a few little suggestions, there's a few tweaks that I would make to Star Wars Rebellion, because I do play it an awful lot. There are certain cards that are underpowered that never get chosen. There's certain things that you always overlook, you always skip that, and that's not worth it. Oh, that's not worth it. But not many. For the most part, it's probably like a 97% perfect game for me, and that's really good. Most games don't hit that high. But I would love to see a Clone Wars version of Star Wars Rebellion. This way you could potentially send it off as a new edition, but it would be a separate version. This way you wouldn't necessarily rule out the original Star Wars Rebellion. You could play Clone Wars Rebellion. Maybe it's compatible. Maybe it has a way to also serve as an expansion to Star Wars Rebellion. Or just straight up make another expansion to Star Wars Rebellion. That's definitely something else that they could do. But I would love to see, kind of a big 4X kind of larger game. Again, there's definitely all the mechanics, all the theme that Clone Wars fits right into what Star Wars Rebellion is doing. So I don't think it would be that hard. I've talked at length about what I would love to see, a Clone Wars Rebellion do, or even be able to have a game that deals with the end of the Clone Wars and the beginning of the Empire. Like, for example, it does start the Imperial player with maybe Venators and Architans, but they can no longer build new ones. So your new stuff is all the new Imperial stuff. But maybe that Legacy Clone Wars stuff that you start off with has some interesting advantages. Maybe it has a different color dice. And so you want to try to keep those Venators and Architans alive as long as you can, because you can't make new ones. Things like that. So there's some thoughts there that maybe you could do to make all of that work together. But I'd love to see a Clone Wars Rebellion. But let me know down in the comments if there are other like Star Wars battles, scenes, and things that just aren't represented in current tabletop games that you'd love to see. There's a new show called Skeleton Crew coming out soon. Could it offer a a good enough setting to justify a pirate-based game? Will it have enough starships to revitalize interests in space combat? We will have to wait and see. I will be watching that one. Very interesting, even though it is seeming like it's targeting a kid audience. So was Star Wars Rebels at the time, and that turned out to be one of the greatest Star Wars stories of all time, in my opinion. Let me know what you guys think, though, down in the comments below. I will talk to you later. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Big thanks to my patrons. You guys are out of this world. Thank you so much for your continued support, and I will talk to you later. May the Force be with you. Live long and prosper. Be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes, and always wash your socks.